My remarks this morning are called A God Even Agnostics Can Believe In. You see, theology is the study of God and God's relationship to humanity and to the world. And most people don't study theology, and I have to tell you that those who do can't agree on the language we use for God or even the concepts about God. In an effort to figure this out, one well-known church council made the decision that determining who God and Jesus were. Jesus was very God of very God. What in the world does that mean? But that was their solution. In trying to figure out who Jesus was and his relationship to God, and then who God is and was, the church fathers went round and round. So, a little history. At one time, the church taught that God exists in three modes of existence. That is, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. This meant it was kind of like I can be both a wife and a mother and a sister all at once. But this popular view was eventually discarded because how could Jesus pray to God if he was God? So how can I, with my mother hat on, tell myself with my sister hat on what I think? So that one went by his wayside. Another idea was that the Son was subordinate to the Father. But that didn't sit well with some Christians, so that one went out the window too. In the year 200, a lot of years after Jesus, a man by the name of Tertullian figured out that there were three beings of God of equal power, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and yet this was one God, was all three, was in all three. The Trinity is what he called it, and it was terribly confusing and contradictory, so the conclusion was that if it made sense, then it wouldn't be a mystery, so it had to be right. Are there three gods? Well, kind of, but not exactly. And is there one God? Well, kind of, but not exactly. It was just people trying to answer the question, who is God and Jesus, and what is this all about? Okay. So, I think what's interesting is that the only place in the Bible where it mentions the Trinity, not in that word, is 1 John 5, 7 and 8. It says, there are three that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood. And these three agree. But this verse is only found in the later Latin manuscript of the 1500s. It is not in any of the earlier Greek manuscripts. Erasmus was a scholar who had all of these Greek manuscripts, and he was making an addition to the New Testament, and he didn't put that in there. But that time, everybody's teaching about the Trinity. So they came to him and they complained. He says, it's not in the Greek manuscripts. You find it in the Greek manuscript, I'll put it in the next edition. So they found a Greek manuscript with that in there, and the next edition had it in there, and ours does as well. 1 John 5, 7 and 8, complete fiction. Now, I point out this egregious story to illustrate the problems the church has always had in trying to define God, who God is and how Jesus fits into this. Susan Schneider, a professor of New Testament in Berkeley, says of the Trinity, God is more than two men and a bird. She said, this is a New Testament instructor. The Bible is a human text, not an oracle. God did not dictate the Bible any more than God literally created the universe out of nothing in 7 calendar days. The biblical texts then bear all the marks of human composition, historical and theological, religious insight, prejudice, factual error, and moral limitations. Okay, one theologian named Emily Towns calls herself a reluctant Christian. She continues to think that Christianity is a wonderful religion, but hardly anyone is actually doing it. Another fellow I read, George Fowler, wrote in his spiritual memoir called Dance of a Fallen Monk. He was a former Benedictine monk who writes that the church is like, it's not complimentary. The church is like a school principal who has forgotten that the primary purpose of the institution is to provide a guidance, to educate, and then to graduate the students. Not to keep them in the institution, trying to hold them, to keep them dependent, but rather to encourage them towards spiritual maturity. Now hang in there for me because I'm quite aware of what I've just done to you. I'm showing you theologians who are skeptics, who do not place the Bible on a pedestal. I have revealed the shenanigans of the church fathers in trying to figure out who God is, including being dishonest. And I have suggested that perhaps the church has been wrong-headed in its focus, perhaps in ways that keep us religiously dependent rather than becoming spiritually mature. I hope you're still with me on this. Okay. I'm going to put this idea alongside my view that we really don't do a good job, even today, of articulating God, and as a result, many people simply say, I don't believe in God, or I'm an agnostic when it comes to God. So that doesn't speak to you, that's fine. I want you to keep listening because some of your friends or neighbors are saying that, or are certainly thinking it. Now, the church is changing, and it always does change with the times, hopefully. And I think this congregation is part of that cutting edge as the church begins to deal with the realities of here and now and where we are in the 21st century. But first, and as a part of that, we have to work on the God construct that is causing good people to give up on religion. And it is in large part because the God stuff they think we stand for is simply not working for them. So in my remaining time, I'm going to clear up all of the God questions. Hang in there, we're going to go fast. First of all, I got to say, William James is a writer of studying religion, and he said there's two constructs about religion. One is a second-hand religion, and one is a first-hand. First, a second-hand religion is simply based on believing that we hear what we hear from other people and what other people teach, and it's what others say that the Bible says. Agnostics and atheists who say, I don't believe in God, or even simply skeptical Christians, are really questioning the God teaching that comes from a second-hand religion, not necessarily God. But first-hand religion is a relationship to the reality of what we call God or the Spirit of God. How to get to the God question, to that first-hand relationship? Well, first you have to skip the attempt to rationally solve it. It's a mystery, it cannot be solved. But there are a variety of ways to move us toward that first-hand religion, towards belief, if you will, towards the experience of God. One way is to turn to symbols. Symbols point to a larger reality. St. Julian of Norwich played with symbols for God as Father and Mother. And she writes, as truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our Mother. And God revealed that in everything, and especially in these sweet words, where He, she says, I am the power and goodness of fatherhood. I am the wisdom and lovingness of motherhood. I am the light and grace, which is all blessed love. And our hymn that we sang, kind of the many names, kind of gets at some of those many symbols. We can also understand God through this symbol, or the word of wisdom. Every time the word logos appears in the gospel, it can legitimately be translated as Sophia. What happens to our understanding when we read the Gospel of John? It says, Sophia was present with God from the beginning, active in creation, and is present in the created world. And in the beginning was Sophia, and Sophia was with God, and Sophia was God. She was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through her, and the light was the light for the people. She was in the world, and the world came into being through her. Yet the world did not know her. And Sophia became flesh and dwelt among us. Perfectly credible way of translating that. That language shift may create new possibilities as we think about Godness. Another way to look at the God question is to ask, who do we need God to be? Not in our ego center, but in our deeply authentic center. There's always the danger of making God in our own image, but there's also the idea that who we are determines who God needs to be for us. So Marcus Borg in his book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, suggests there are 3 themes of Jesus, of God, that we can pull from the scriptures that might meet our needs. I'm going to suggest a 4th, but they are the Exodus, which is the journey toward leading from Egypt and Babylon as the Israelites go into the wilderness. The Exodus is a journey of liberation and homecoming. For those of us who have a need because we feel restricted and in bondage or enslaved, or to perhaps addiction or other kinds of ways of being enslaved, we need liberation. So we need a God who can liberate us from that and bring us out of our bondage. Perhaps it's the bondage of low self-esteem, the sense that we're never good enough, or other such lies that we might believe. Perhaps it's feeling trapped in other people's stereotypes because of our sexual orientation, or gender, or color of our skin. God liberates us by saying, "You are made in my image." This God shifts our attention away from our chains to the open prison door. The Bible calls God a liberator in this story, and we need that if we need liberation. Second idea of who God is, according to Borg, is the exile story. So the Israelites were wandering around for generations there in the wilderness. This is a key story for those who feel lost and wandering. Perhaps we're trying to find meaning in our life, or our purpose for living, or searching for acceptance, or wondering where we belong. God is the steady presence by our side. Remember the fire and the clouds helping with the Israelites. "I will never abandon or forsake you," God says. There's the understanding that there is nowhere in our lost state that God cannot be found. There is nowhere that love is not present. It is the God who endures, who suffers with us by our side. The Bible calls God then an abiding presence, God with us. The third image of Borg puts out is that one of the priestly story of Jesus' death and resurrection, his physical body undergoing trial and trauma as do we, and his physical body could not be contained. This, of course, is the story and the image that has won out in the 20th and 21st century in evangelical and mostly mainstream white Christianity, for sure. It is a story with its Jewish ideas of scapegoats and atonement that provides comfort for some who finds God in that story. The 4th one I want to put out is really more where a progressive church like ours comes from. A macro story that we would gravitate to because we focus on the gospel stories of Jesus and his followers and the early church. Borg reminds us this was an inclusive movement in a society ordered by a purity system. The inclusiveness of the Jesus movement embodied a radically alternative social vision. Whereas purity divides and excludes, inclusiveness or compassion unites and includes. For Jesus, compassion had a radical socio-political meaning. The purity system was subverted and an alternative social vision was affirmed. The politics of purity was replaced by a politics of compassion. So the Gospels in this situation offer us a just and compassionate God who has open arms for everybody, not just those who are pure, everybody. So, who do we need God to be for us? I have to tell you a story. When I was a campus minister, a young man came into my office, an evangelical. They usually didn't come in to see me, but this one did because he was in a lot of spiritual angst. South Korean, I believe. And he was in a spiritual angst because he was overwhelmed with his inability to connect to God. And he was on his knees several times a day. He was reading his Bible. And he was praying like crazy. And God was just not there. And I said, well, who are you praying to? Describe your God to me. And he said, well, probably male and maybe on a throne in heaven. And I said, and his physical characteristics would be probably a white male. And I said to him, now before I tell you what I said, this is a perfect example of a second-hand religion. A symbol somebody else had given him to believe. And try as he might, it didn't work for him. It didn't bring him closeness or comfort. And he thought the problem was him. He was doing everything that he could, but his God was far away. So I said to him, that God that you described cannot possibly understand your lived experience. Cannot possibly get in your skin. How could that God know you to your core? I told him to start praying to one who truly understood his life. Answering who we need God to be might help us answer the God question. Now, we don't have to turn to language or metaphors or symbols or even the Bible or the Gospels to catch a glimpse of God that works for us. I throw this in for the humanist in our midst. We can experience godness not just through our minds or through finding that which meets our deepest needs and longings. We can have an experience of God. One way is through creativity. How many artists finish a work of art, and after they're done, they look at it and they say, where did this come from? They were lost in the creative process and plugged into something else. How many musicians lose themselves completely in the performance of a creative piece and only later wonder at what happened? Years ago, I had an employee who was an artist on his non-working hours, and he had the opportunity to hear Christian theologian Matthew Fox lecture. And Matthew Fox focused on science and on the technology and the wonders of all of the intricacies of science in the planetary universe. And he used the word awe to describe that. After the program ended, this hardened agnostic could not wait to talk to me. He said, I don't know that I believe in God, Beverly, but I believe in awe. As an artist, he had experienced the creative process, and he knew awe. And the theologian had named it as sacred. Letting go of our egos can become a sacred act. Anytime we move out of control, creative masterpieces are created. Musical notes touch hearts in new ways. Spirits are uplifted, and we experience something beyond ourselves. When we touch something beyond ourselves, I call that God. Physical intimacy also has that possibility. When we submerge into sensual pleasure and fall into the warmth of the love and caring of a trusted partner, we lose control and we just let go, and the walls come down, and this expansion leads us to a oneness with our partner or with the sacred that is larger than that. In that situation, the ego disappears and the moment becomes sacred. Alice Walker, in her book, The Color Purple, describes this expansion into oneness when her character Shug explains how she moved as a black woman from the image of God as an old white man to a sacred experience. Shug says, at first it was trees, then air, then birds, then other people. And then one day, she explains, I knew that if I cut a tree, my arm would bleed. Oneness, oneness. One time I rented a car in Flagstaff, Arizona to drive south to Sedona. I had always heard about how lovely it was, so I avoided the major highways and I took the back road, and from the higher elevation of Flagstaff down to the lower elevation of Sedona. There were lots of evergreens, lots of green stuff on the side as I went down the curves down the highway. It was like a tunnel. And then I rounded a curve, and with no warning at all, stood for centuries right in front of me these beautifully brilliant red gashes of rocks against a blue sky. I was stunned. I had to keep myself from breaking. I can't stop here, won't run curves. Okay, so I went around another curve, and there was another breathtaking vista before me. Everything I had been thinking, everything I'd been planning was gone. My head could not feel anything. There was nothing in there except the experience of this breathtaking beauty in front of me. So unexpected that it had taken my breath away. It was awe. And it turned my thoughts to Job. Where were you when I made the universe? Indeed, this sacred experience shifted my mind and perspective the remainder of the day. I also have to believe in a godness in the universe because I have given birth to an 8-pound baby girl. And pain and suffering aside, the exquisite beauty and wonder of that moment of seeing and holding this creation expelled from my body into a breathing world can only be described as sacred. Now, we could ask if we need God. I would ask, is there a need for compassion in our world, in our human experience? Is there a need for healing in our brokenness? Yes. A resounding yes. Is there a need for experiences of awe and wonder in the human psyche? I would say a resounding yes. All cultures know this and have tried to tap into it and express that which cannot be named. Some eagerly call it sacred. Others do not use that language, but would recognize the power of those experiences. Few would argue that those don't contribute to a good life. Yes, there is something. Sophia, goodness, love, mystery, awe, ecstasy, God, something that cannot quite be explained, but something that moves my spirit towards gratitude and humility and transformation. So the God problem is not really about who God is or if God is. The issue is our relationship to the sacred, however it is defined. It is not whether or not God exists. It is whether we have lost ourselves in the wonder and awe or been overwhelmed with gratitude. It's whether we've ever felt drowned in an abundance of love. Feeling at the lowest point of our lives and our deepest sorrow and our biggest trial, and then finding comfort and presence of someone in our time of need. It is being confronted with the hardest questions and finding peace with an answer with a capital A, perhaps, even as the answer with a small a may still elude us. As you might have already guessed, in order to solve the God problem, when we hear or say, I don't believe in God, or the problem is not the word God. The problem is the word believe. It does not matter what the head says, or whether science can document the existence or non-existence of a divinity, whether in a materialistic understanding of the universe there is a creator God in that mix. What matters is our spiritual yearning to be known and loved and surprised and humbled in an amazing abundance in our lives, to be sustained, that which calls us to be more than we thought possible. The experience of the sacred, whether we call it God or not, always leaves us a changed and a transformed people. To be and do more than we were reared to be or do. To think higher and greater than others think is possible. I think the songwriter Joss Stone captures this shift in her song, Free Me. She says, there's something deep inside of me I've got to be, and if you follow it hard, if you find it hard to follow me, if I lose you in my jet stream, then you only have to raise your eyes and see me fly. Don't tell me that I won't, I can. Don't tell me that I don't, that I'm not, I am. Don't tell me that I won't, I will. Don't tell me how to think, I feel. Don't tell me because I know what's real. indeed. Shall we call this experience of first-hand religion God? Or shall we call it awe and mystery, Sophia, Jesus, deliverance, liberation, or just love? Is it only material world? Is it all atoms and molecules? Because there's a certain arrogance to think that we really ever understand what is beyond our mental capabilities. As Job 38 says, indeed, where were you when the universe was created, when the rains came? Let us not get caught up in the trappings of language or the pitfalls of dogma, the rationality of science, or the irrationality of miracles. Whether we know God or not, we are already called by name. We are already known. We are already seen. The experience of the sacred awaits us. We can because love does. We are because love is. And that is a God we can believe in.